Do you guys know what the Christmas creep is? Some of you have dealt with the Christmas creep, I'm sure. That drunk boss who seems to stand conveniently under the mistletoe, under the influence at the Christmas party, and quite possibly now is under investigation for stealing kisses from unsuspecting interns as they seek to slink past him through the only door in and out of the venue, and of course, under his mistletoe. That is a Christmas creep of sorts, but it's not the Christmas creep I'm referring to. The Christmas creep can be traced back to the 1980s. It's a term that describes how retailers sneak their Christmas merchandise onto the shelves in small amounts early in the year. So Christmas stuff just kind of creeps up slowly, making us believe that it's time to start spending money. Oh, here it is. Oh, wow. Is it that time of the year? Oh, I better hurry up and do my shopping. You know, whoever is first gets the best share of the Christmas expenditure. They laugh all the way to the bank, and the consumers don't know what hit them. Now, is it their fault? Not really, because consumers drive the market, and we consume early, regularly, hard. If you were to wait until Christmas to put your Christmas stuff out as a retailer, you would probably miss out on your fair share of that lucrative market. And so even the Christmas creep, it seems, can sometimes creep earlier and earlier into the year. Ever been to a party and had a conversation with someone that went something like, "You'll never guess what, I was at East Gardens this week. Did you know Maya's already playing Christmas carols? And I went to Target and they've already got their stuff out on the shelves. It's phenomenal." You know, whether we realize it or not, we mark time by seasonal markers. We get a sense of time when these things appear. Think about it. There's quite possibly some decor in our houses that is seasonal. So we see the pool rings re-emerge on the lawn and the cozies are on the line, and we think, oh, it's summer. Beautiful. I love this time of year. Whereas the flannelette bed sheets come out and the hot water bottles and the big thick gown hung on the hook, and we think winter has arrived. In our house growing up, it was always Mum's pressure cooker on the stove, churning out bowls of soup in these really old two-tone kind of soup bowls with one handle off the side like Shrek's ear. I'll never forget it. That's winter growing up for me. In summer, it was watermelon, a tray of peaches on the sink, and of course, Richie Benno, Bill Laurie, Tony Gregg permeated the house as they commentated the cricket. That's summer. Certain markers tell us what time it is, and we recognise special days throughout our life or throughout the year. We make resolutions. When? On the first day, of course, New Year's resolutions. We know when we're starting to make them, New Year's approaching. We celebrate people we love on the day that they were born. We see many women wear hats once a year, and people go in enter sweepstakes that they don't do any other day except Melbourne Cup Day. We buy red roses on Valentine's Day for... No, that's not one. The point is, there are certain events and articles that are tellers of time, aren't there? And the book of Luke, in the opening chapter, marks a significant time in God's kingdom in a most peculiar way. In verse 5, in the first chapter, the story of John the Baptist's birth begins. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest of Abijah's division named Zechariah. That's a timestamp. Whereas the story about Jesus' birth in the same chapter begins very differently. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man. Notice here that the infancy narratives of both John the Baptist and Jesus begin with telling the time. This is the time. Now, often time is marked by the shifting power of prominent men, which in the case of John's birth, it surely was. However, in the kingdom of God, as it breaks into the world through Jesus Christ, it will be a time marked by the progression of the pregnancy of an unknown woman, a young virgin, which verse 27 continues to tell us the virgin's name was Mary. You may be familiar with the term Merry Christmas. Well, for the next few weeks, I want to look at Mary's Christmas. We're going to spend some weeks looking at the amazing Christmas story through the perspective of Mary. We don't tend to do this much in Protestant churches, do we? We leave it up to our Catholic brothers and sisters to look after her. But there is something about Mary. Thought you'd like that one, Yvette. There is something about Mary which I'm sure we'll be blessed by. And I hope that we'll gain a new appreciation for this favoured woman and what it might have been like for her to live out that first Christmas. In Luke 1:27, we get a clue from the sequence in which Mary is introduced to us just how much social standing she had on her own merit. We read, the angel Gabriel was sent to a virgin engaged to a man named Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. You see, here's how we're going to be telling this story. She's a virgin. She's in a relationship, though, with this really nice guy, cool guy named Joseph. And he happens to be from good lineage. He's from, David's house, King David. And, oh yeah, that's right, her name. What was it? Mary. Yeah, that virgin I kind of mentioned. She's given no social order at this point. No familial background. Her claim to fame, if you will, is that she's engaged, betrothed, pledged to, promised to, bound to Joseph. I use those words for us to understand the significance of the relationship of engagement in this culture. Engagement to be married was a serious commitment, to the point where if you wanted to break off your engagement for any reason, you needed to get divorced. If a man were to die during an engagement, his fiancée would become what was classified a widow. So in the eyes of the law, there was this really kind of strange term that emerged, a widow, a virgin widow. All of that is to say that Mary and Joseph were not just going steady. They were seriously bound to one another in the most significant way. In fact, possibly more than many marriages today. Her engagement to Joseph was Mary's social order. That was her significance. So her standing was really based on Joseph. When we compare this to Elizabeth in the first chapter, which is John the Baptist's mum, in verse 5, we read, in the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest of Abijah's division named Zechariah. His wife was from the daughters of Aaron. There's a social standing. That's significant. And her name was Elizabeth. She's significant. Elizabeth was not only married to a priest, but herself from a priestly lineage. And that is made clear. It was often said that an excellent woman deserves to be married to a priest. Well, Elizabeth was from one and to one in marriage, and therefore had a recognised social standing all of her own, it would appear from this passage. And then there's Mary. Her claim to fame, apart from Joseph, was virginity. A virgin engaged to a great guy, but she is yet to gain his social status, yet to gain his lineage. They're engaged, but they're not married yet. So what's your claim to fame? Do you think about it? People around you might know it. They might hear it all the time. You might not realise. What's your social standing? What's important that you portray? Does it come from your own family? Are you from one of those well-known family names? I used to party with a guy named Paddo and found out after some time that he was Banjo Patterson's grandchild or great-grandchild or something, which was quite cool, I thought. Pretty cool. Does your significance come from someone you're dating? Does it come from someone you know and you got photos with them somewhere and posted it? Do you find yourself forging an identity based on your career position or some achievement or ability that you have? What or who is your social standing based on? Perhaps some of us feel like Mary. We don't have much of a status on our own, not one that bears a mention anyway. And maybe like Mary, we're actually waiting for an ascribed social standing, an ascribed honour that will get us through into a relationship, maybe from one of these achievements we're pursuing. And you know what? It all seems to be going quite well at this point, so we're actually feeling pretty good. Things are falling into place. We're about to get a new job. We're about to graduate. We're about to do something. We're heading in the right direction. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. But you know what? Mary was headed in the right direction too. She had a coming standing, a coming lineage. She had her mapped out purpose and significance. But things aren't always what they seem with God, are they? What Mary saw coming was turned upside down in a visit from an angel, a divine revelation through a divine messenger, and a status reversal that would shake her world. Her significance would not come from her expected source. Her status, her social standing, her significance and her security would not come from her husband. It would come from God's Son, Jesus, whom she would carry. It would come from God's own choice and God's own initiative to bless her with child. And if I might borrow the sentiment from the Apostle Paul, not through works, so Mary can't boast. Nor should we elevate her to anything more than a blessed and favoured woman. Luke, verse 28. And the angel came to her and said, "Greetings, favoured woman, the Lord is with you." By this greeting, Gabriel does not mean, as the Roman Catholic Church teaches, that she is full of favour in the sense that she's able to grant favour. But rather, she herself was a recipient of the favour of God by His grace, which many of us are. aren't we? This word favour is a term used of all believers in Ephesians 1:6, where it's translated lavished or bestowed. It says, to the praise of his glorious grace that he lavished on us in the beloved one. So again, it portrays Mary as the recipient and not the dispenser of divine grace, as are all believers. Mary's standing would not come from works, but that's not saying she had no work to do. My goodness. I hope in the next few weeks as we journey through Christmas, from her perspective, we will get the realization that she is a model of courage and faithfulness for all Christians, Catholic and Protestant. Maybe we don't give her enough attention in that regard. When Gabriel visited Mary to tell her of God's amazing plan and that God was graciously choosing her to be part of it, it was by no means a joyful reaction that some of us might expect when God comes and says, I choose you. You're the one I'm using. We remember Moses. He freaked out. Most people beg for God to go elsewhere. It's a harrowing situation when God says, I choose you for something great, isn't it? Saying yes to God's plan is never easy in practice, even if in sentiment or anticipation. But in practice, saying yes is really never easy. Saying no to God's easy. People say no to God every day. We all say no to God more often than we'd like to admit. But saying yes to God, that's so hard. Why? Because it's risky, right? It's scary. It's out of control. It's out of our control. It's not out of his. But we want control. We can't see where it's headed ultimately. And we don't pack our own provisions, certainly not enough for the entire journey. There's a word for this journey. It's called faith. Hebrews 11:6 says it's impossible to please God without it. Mary had faith. She said yes to God in an environment that could have destroyed her if God didn't deliver. That's faith. Putting it all on the line in the hope that God's capability and his integrity will line up in accordance with his promise. That's why the more we exercise faith, the more it strengthens. Because God's integrity and his capability are demonstrated to us again and again and again. That's why Israel always, if not often, looked back to the exodus from Egypt and that deliverance and provision of God as fuel for their faith. That's why pastors always bang on about the history of a church where God provided and prevailed. And the reason is because God can be trusted to hear, guys. He can be trusted to hear, so he can be trusted to there. Let's go. In accordance with his leading. Mary showed courageous and exemplary faith when she said in verse 38, "See, I am the Lord's servant. May it happen to me as you have said." And we might finish that statement for her, perhaps, in the little artistic negativity, to say, because Gabriel, is that your name? If this doesn't work, I'm dead. I will become an unmarried pregnant woman. And you know what that means. I will be ridiculed, I'll be rejected, unaccepted by the love of my life, publicly denounced, absolutely socially ostracized, with no ability to protect myself or provide for myself or my baby. This plan of God's, if it doesn't work, is going to kill me. And as I reflected on that hypothetical response, I thought none of that happened to Mary, and it all happened to her son. That was God's plan. Not for her, for Jesus, for us. A plan to which Mary's yes was an extremely dangerous yes. A yes that was every bit as courageous as it was dangerous. A yes that contrasts profoundly with Zechariah's response to Gabriel's visitation and prophecy of him in the same chapter. Zechariah received similar news, although it was a lot less threatening to him, from the safety of his temple position and the security of his marriage. Gabriel visited Zechariah and announced to him that his wife Elizabeth was actually going to be bearing a child. She'd been formerly barren, but guess what? Good news, you're going to have a child. Through conventional means, of course. No immaculate conception. And yet, this devout priest responds with at least a certain amount of unbelief, evidenced by his silencing. Look at verse 20. The angel Gabriel says, "You will become silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time." Meanwhile, that virgin, what's her name? Mary. That young girl, probably mid-teens, Joseph's chick. She has incredible faith in decidedly more dangerous circumstances than the priest. We have recently spoken to our youth about Paul's words to Timothy. Don't let anyone despise your youth, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Isn't that good? Let Mary be a great example of that. If it's not an age maturity and it's a spiritual maturity that we're insecure about in the face of so-called mature people, don't let anyone despise your youth, physical or spiritual. You don't have to grow into your faith. You just need to exercise your faith and let it grow in you. That's growing people. You can move mountains with faith like that, and you don't have to wait to do it. Jesus' words. Just have faith. Remember, we have here a priest silenced for lack of faith. His wife will finally receive the socially advantageous gift of a child, while Mary is consenting to the socially disastrous circumstance of a pregnancy outside marriage. While it may sound like Zechariah and Mary say similar things with their words, their hearts must have been in different places. The one we'd expect to respond with total faith responds with enough hesitation to be rebuked by the angel, and yet the girl without standing has the faith to take on a significantly, eternally significant role in the kingdom of God. And now remember, she was the recipient of grace and not the dispenser of it. Just like us. That means that by the grace of the same God, we too can take our place of eternal significance in His kingdom. We really can, by walking with Him in faith on a journey. Are we ready to be used by God? Harrowing proposition. To consent to a dangerous life without anything more than His promise? Let's be inspired by Mary's Christmas. You know, if we're used to seeing those nativity scenes, the artworks and so on, we might make the mistake that she's pretty soft. She looks sometimes pretty simple or sedate. She does to me. Those, of course, are just artist impressions. But I don't think they're really good impressions based on what we read. The real Mary, she was courageous enough to say yes to God's plan in the face of legitimate fear. She was tenacious, actually, enough to keep up with her son in his later years of ministry. And she was persistent enough to even follow him to his death. She was dangerous in all the ways that believers should be dangerous. Mary submitted to God's plan despite what it would cost. And that's the model for all believers to follow. I hope we'll adopt that model this Christmas. She's a model of courage and faithfulness for us. So let's be inspired by this great woman, the least, who's definitely one of the greatest, and say yes to God's plan even when we're afraid.